We're going to be creating a stop and a start timer that's going to start the counter when we hit the start button and stop the counter when we hit the stop button. And it's going to output the time in minutes, seconds, and milliseconds. So in a readable format. And this is going to be using the set interval to update the interval and output for the timer. And then also using the current get time with the current time and calculating the number of milliseconds that's the difference between the start time and the end time. And that will give us an accurate output that we can use in order to use and output a timer for start and stop time, which could be based on the timestamp. So that's all coming up in this lesson. Let's look at the getTime method, which returns a number of milliseconds from the ECMAScript epoch time, based off of a starting date of January 1st, 1970 UTC time. So in order to return the value, we'll select one value, and this can be the start value. And using the new date, we want to get a date value. So this can be a date from a certain time period. First, 2000. Within the console, we'll use the start and then getTime method in order to return back the number of milliseconds from the start date of January 1st, 1970 to July 1st, 2000. Let's take a look and we'll see what we've got for an output within the console. So that's going to return back a time in milliseconds. And then you can use these as time differences in order to calculate the difference in milliseconds between two different time periods. So this is going to provide a much more accurate passage of time and a way to calculate the time. So if we want to find out the end time, we'll set another date. And this time we'll use August 1st, 2000. And then return back the getTime value for the end date, which is going to be larger than the first one because this is at a later date. So more milliseconds have passed. Let's make a calculation of the difference. So the difference between the end date minus the start date will give us a number of milliseconds between the two. Output those as well into the console. So that's how many milliseconds are between the two. If we want to calculate out the number of seconds that have passed between the two, we can use the difference for the interval. So parse it as an integer and take the difference divided by 1000, and that will give us the number of seconds. If we want to calculate out the number of minutes between the two, we can take the difference, divide it by 1000, and then further divide it by 60, and that will return back the number of minutes. Let's output these values into the console. So it gives us the number of minutes and the number of seconds. We can also use the same format in order to calculate out the number of hours. So calculating out the number of hours between the two. So that gives us 744. Let's calculate out the number of days for the difference. And we got 24 hours in a day. So that gives us a difference between 31 days from July 1st to August 1st. So if we're calculating out what the difference is. And these are some of the values that we can use in order to calculate the passage of time from one starting point to an ending point using the getTime method. So let's go ahead and we're going to set up a project. So adding in some page elements onto the page, we're going to have a couple buttons as well as a timer area where we're going to output some content. So we want to select the main page element that has a class of main, selecting it into a usable JavaScript object using the document query selector, selecting the element with a class of main, and then within here we can create some elements and add them into that main object. We're going to need an area that we can output a value to the user. So this will be the main timer object, and this is where we're going to display the timer value to the user. And using the create element, let's go ahead and create a div there. And then we need a couple buttons. So we'll have a button to start the timer. And once again, we'll use the document and create the element. And the element that we're creating is going to be a button. So just duplicate that and we've got button 1 and the button 2, so that will add a couple buttons to the page. Also a main global game object that we can use in order to hold values within that. And for that, we're going to just set the 1 value, and that will be a timer. So that will be the starting value for the game timer that we're going to increment, and we're going to check to see the difference between the 2 start times. So let's add these to the page. So using the main, first we append the timer, and that's going to be where we're displaying the current time clock. Also append both buttons, so button 1, and then we're also going to be appending the second button to the page, so that will add them both to the page. So there's the 2 buttons on the page. Let's add in some text content into the button. So set that up and have one button to start, and the other one is going to be to stop. So that will be start and a stop button for the page. So there's our start and stop button, and then adding in an event listener for the buttons. So setting up the first button, let's add an event listener, and the event that we're listening for is going to be a click. So whenever the click happens, they're going to start the timer. We can do that as an anonymous function, or we can separate it out as a separate function. When button 2 is pressed, when it's clicked, then we're going to end the timer. So those are going to be the 2 functions that we're going to be looking for on either one of the buttons. We're going to start by disabling the stop button, so we only have the start button. So selecting button 2, set the disabled value for button 2 to be true, so that way it can't be pressed. We only have the option to press the start button, and this is the one that's going to start the timer. I'm actually going to set this up as a function, so the code can be a little bit cleaner and easier to read. So create a function called start timer, and then we'll also have one that will end the timer. And that will be for the button 2, so end timer. And then we'll set that function up as well so that we can add some code into there. So we've got the start and stop. So for the start timer, whenever we click it, let's just make sure that the button is clickable. And I'll just type into the console start. And for the end timer, type into the console the end. So there's our start value. We want to enable and disable the buttons. So once it gets clicked, I'm going to set the button 2 to be false, and then button 1 will be set to be true. So once you start it, then you have an option to stop it. And we'll do the opposite for the end timer, where we're going to disable the button and set this one to be false, set this one to be true. I'm also going to do a console clear, so clear out the existing content within the console. So we'll just have the start and the stop running within the console. So next up, we want to select and get the start time from the current date whenever it's started. And we'll set that up where we're going to get the current date and using the new date object. And this will just pick up whatever the current time is. And then let's set the game start and give the game start a value from the date get time. So this will get whatever the current time is in milliseconds. And I'm also within the game object, I want to set the start value to be null and the end value to be null as well. So that gives us a starting time. Next we want to get the end time. So we can use the same format where when we end the timer, we want to get whatever the current date is. We can use the date variable as well. And here we want to get the end time using the date get time. And then we want to calculate the total time that it took that the timer was running. So this is going to be the total time. And we can get this by selecting the game start value and subtracting the game start from the game end. And that will give us the number of milliseconds that have actually passed. We're going to divide it by 1000 so that we end up with milliseconds. And for now, within the console, we'll output whatever the total time is. So we start and then we stop, and that gives us the number of milliseconds that passed. And this is going to be giving us a value within seconds. So that time it was 1.79 seconds. The first time before that it was just before 1 second. So let's go ahead and we're going to set a function that will show the current timer. And this will output the start time and the end time and calculate out the elapsed time between the two. And if we want to output this on a regular interval, we can use the interval in order to set this, in order to view that. So that's going to be the timer, and I'm actually going to set this as well to be null. And this is what we can use as the interval. So that will be the game timer will be the interval. So within the function, set the game timer using the set interval function. And within here, we're just doing an anonymous function. We're going to set the interval. And then when we want to display it, so if we want to display it for every 10 milliseconds, we can output that result there. Let's get the elapsed time, or the difference of the two times. We want to get whatever the current value is for get time minus the game start value. Let's calculate out the number of minutes for this value, and we'll set up some variables for it. So we've got the minutes, we've got seconds, and then there's also the milliseconds. So we'll declare all of those variables so that we can set the time for the minutes. And using the parse integer, we've got the difference in time, and we can divide it by just as we did before, and that will return back the number of minutes. So just as we were over here where we're calculating out the minutes. Now in order to make the adjustment, we want to check to see if the number of minutes is less than 10, and if it is, then we're going to add a 0 to the value of the minutes. So that will make it more readable. Otherwise, we'll just take whatever the value of the minutes is. So this will result in a value for the minutes. And actually, this should be, we'll just update this all to be MINS. So that will give us an output, a string value for the minutes. And we'll do the same for the seconds. So returning back the seconds value. And if the seconds is less than 10, then we're going to add a 0 in front of it. And we'll update the value for the seconds. So this one is just divided by 1000 in order to get that output value. But subtracting out the value of the minutes from the seconds, and then also subtracting out the value of the seconds from the milliseconds. So in order to do that, for the milliseconds, we have the difference between the elapsed time, so it's the number of milliseconds. And then we can have a condition that checks the milliseconds and sees if it's greater than 1000. And if it is, then we're going to return back the value of milliseconds and just the remainder for the milliseconds of the 1000. And we do that as well for the seconds in order to make the adjustment for the minutes. So if the seconds is going to be larger than 60, then we take the seconds and we turn back a value of just the remainder for the modulus of 60. So within the console for now, let's output the result that we have for the minutes. And I'll use this using the backticks, so the template literals. So output the value of minutes and separate this by the value of seconds and using the colon to make the separation. So once we start, we want to launch the show timer being calculated in a more readable format where we've got the minutes, the seconds, and then the milliseconds changing. So instead of outputting it into the console, let's output it into the timer area as text output. And that will just be whatever we've got for the show time that we're outputting. And using the text content, we can output that same string that we're output into the console and output that into the text timer. And then what we also want to do is we want to start the timer. So whenever we hit start, we want to start the show timer. And then we want to stop it whenever the end timer. So we want to stop the game counter, the interval. So let's add in the clear of the interval where we've got the game timer, and we check to see if game timer, and if it is, then let's go ahead and we're going to clear the interval. So clear the interval of the game timer. And the game timer is the interval that we set over here. So we start and we stop, we start and we stop, And this gives us a start and stop counter that's very accurate because it's taking the get time difference. And we can also apply some styling to the buttons. So let's update for the button 1, and using the style, set a background color for that. And I'll set the background color for that one to be red, or maybe that one should be green and then the other one can be red. So green, and button 2 is going to be red for the stop button. Let's update both the buttons and add a style for the color. So set the font color to be white, and we can do that for both of them. And you can also apply additional styling as needed in order to make the buttons stand out. So that's how you can make a start and a stop counter using the get time and the interval in JavaScript.